and kick it off. Okay, we're live.
Good evening and welcome to this Plough event. We're very glad to have so many of you joining us, and we're so glad that you've come here for this wonderful conversation that we're going to have tonight about feminisms and what it means to be a woman and a man, and so many other things that we're exploring in the new issue of Plough. This event tonight is kind of a mini launch, and we're going to run a bunch of events for our new issue. I'm just going to show it here. This is our new Plough issue. It's here. Let me get this on the screen. What are families for? And it's just hit the streets, and it's also online on the Plough site, where we explore the questions in here. And of course, one of my favorite articles in here is by one of our panelists here tonight, Leah Sargeant. Dependence is called Toward an Illiberalism of the Weak, and we want to get into that a little bit tonight. And I really recommend anyone to check it out if you haven't already. We'll be dropping, by the way, links into the chat and into the comments of this event tonight, so that you can click through either an hour later to explore some of these things. I should just mention as well, we'll be doing further events, launching our issue after Christmas and into the new year, notably on January 21st, again with Leah Sargeant, an event with New York Times columnist Ross Douthat. We'll be talking about his piece, The Case for One More Child, and he'll be joined also by Anna Louise Sisman and by Sarah Williams discussing that. So The Case for One More Child, so many people want another child, according to the data. Why aren't they having them? And we'll be keeping you informed. If you'd be interested, definitely check out the Plough site and our events page. We have other exciting online events coming down the pipe. I'd like to thank tonight our co-sponsors, Breaking Ground, that's an online project of the Cardis Institute, as well as Other Feminisms, Leah Libresco's one of her Substacks. It's a community for a feminism of interdependence. I'd like to now introduce our speakers. So Leah Sargeant is the author of Arriving at Amen and Building the Benedict Option. She runs two Substacks. One I mentioned, Other Feminisms, definitely check it out. And the other is the Tiny Book Club. And that's a place to discuss good essays and articles. And we're also honored to be joined by Jenn Frey. She's the Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of South Carolina and a fellow at the Institute of Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. She's published many essays in ethics and the history of philosophy. She was a PI of a multi-million-dollar research project entitled Virtue, Happiness, and the Meaning of Life. And she has recently co-edited a volume of essays titled Virtue and Self-Transcendence. She's also the host of a philosophy and literature podcast that I highly recommend to you, titled Sacred and Profane Love. And we'll drop a link to that podcast into the comments. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it on to our two speakers and to our moderator tonight. That's Susanna Black. She's a senior editor with Plough, as well as an editor with our co-sponsor, the Breaking Ground Project. So welcome to this evening. Thanks for joining us. And we all look forward to what we're going to hear tonight.
Thanks so much, Pete. Jen and Leah, it's so good to have you both here. It is sort of strange to be on, well, whatever, I'm going to skip the sort of Zoom spiel because everyone's done it. Leah, this is a project that, or this event was really kicked off by a kind of Twitter thread that Twitter conversation that you and I had about your piece in the latest issue of Plough. Do you want to give a brief kind of description of that piece, how you came to write it, but also primarily what your arguments are and what your central point is?
Yeah, in this piece titled Dependence, what I'm talking about is who are we and what are we founding our politics and our understanding of ourselves on? Because a lot of the time we talk as though we're working within the frame of classical liberalism, as though the main unit of society were autonomous individuals, and that the goal often of society is to help everyone reach that point. So, when you're in an exceptional place of being dependent on others, what you need is a leg up so that you aren't anymore. When we talk about charity or welfare, we often talk about it as the goal of standing on your own 2 feet. When we talk about people with disabilities, the goal is for them to not need any other help, whether that's fitting someone with an exoskeleton or what have you. But what I see in this is a real hatred of dependence, which is natural to all of us, which isn't something we can just escape and work our way around. And I'll just read you a very brief snippet from the piece to kind of give you a sense of that. A world that holds up independence as the ideal offers us 2 rival duties: to obscure our dependence and to be resentful of it. No woman can lightly assent to the illusion of autonomy. Because a baby is alien to the world of self-ownership, every woman's citizenship in that imaginary republic is tenuous. A world of autonomous individuals can't acknowledge both woman and child simultaneously. Fear and hatred of weakness and dependence wound the dependent most obviously, but are poison to all, even the people who are strong at present. Without repeated reminders that the broken are beloved, how can we remember who God is? And I've really focused this as a question for women because all of us have periods of dependence, most obviously at the beginning and end of our lives. Men can get away for longer with pretending they don't, which is why this question of how do we treat dependence falls most heavily on women, but no one can escape it entirely.
Thanks very much, Leah. So Jenn, the reason, other than you being a perpetually fascinating interlocutor, a reason that I thought you would be a good person to be in conversation with Leah about these topics is that you've recently come out with a piece in America magazine focusing on Ezekiel Emanuel as Joe Biden's choice for sort of COVID task force head. Do you want to describe the points that piece was making and why, the ways in which that ties into the issues that Leah is addressing?
Yeah, thanks. So I really strongly agree with everything that Leah just said. And I mean, for me, I'm a philosopher, and I teach medical ethics. I'm finishing up teaching it now, and so we've been talking about these issues in our medical ethics class. The last unit that we did was on Atul Gawande's book. Atul Gawande, by the way, is also on the COVID task force, and I think he's wonderful.
Yes.
So it was like a small criticism in a way of Biden. Although the fact that I criticized Biden at all, I think prevented a lot of people from hearing what I was actually saying, which is that, look, it's actually pretty dismaying that Biden chose. It's not surprising, but it's very dismaying that he chose Ezekiel Emanuel, because Ezekiel Emanuel is very well known for his position that being old is not something that anyone should desire to prolong or want generally, precisely because old people are burdens, they're weak, they're dependent. They cost more than they give back. And at the root of this idea that he has is, a self-deception, right? It's a false self-image, a very common one. I completely agree that it's more prevalent in men for a variety of reasons. It's sort of like this male ideal of completely independent, and also, a related idea that the measure of a life, of its meaningfulness and of its worth, is the extent to which you've been productive, right? Like, what are you doing? And so Ezekiel Emanuel looks at old people and he's like, yeah, their lives are not meaningful. They're not really giving back anymore, and they're a drain. And therefore, once I turn 75, that's sort of like the magical age that he picked. And of course, Joe Biden himself is, I think, 78. But, he said, I won't, I myself will not engage in any sort of medical interventions, because basically it would be better off, the society would be better off, I would be better off, just kind of letting go. And I think, especially given that we're in the middle of a pandemic where the elderly are among the most vulnerable, this is a really strange choice for Biden. And I also think that, again, this idea that what human beings fundamentally are autonomous individuals, independent, self-producing. The thing is, it's a lie. And so one of the philosophers that I draw on in my piece is Alistair McIntyre, who wrote a book, Dependent Rational Animals, which is so wonderful. And he just makes this point, look, human beings only become independent, practical reasoners through all kinds of networks of dependence. And actually, like, for huge chunks of your life, you're mostly dependent. So you only come to have concepts and language and thought and reason through networks of dependence and care. And the thing is, that's true. And somehow it gets obscured. It gets obscured in all sorts of ways. And I think that, we really need to fight this, because it is a kind of self-deception. And it's a self-deception that creeps into our politics. Like, liberalism pretends that it's neutral, right? That it's not forcing a metaphysical vision on everyone. That's a lie. It is. But it's forcing a false one on all of us, and one that we should really resist.
Thanks so much, Jen. I guess one question that I would have about that is the things that you've both spoken about women, with the implication, sort of one of the obviously many ways in which, or one of the ways that you could argue that women kind of are particularly subversive of the liberal vision of the world, is that, for those of us who have children, and all of us, whether or not we have children, are in some way oriented towards that physically. We carry in our bodies, like, the reality that it's a fake idea that we come into society through a social contract. Like, we know in our bodies that is just make-believe. And I wonder, and one way that, like, that plays out, I think, one way that this can really sort of bite in is if we think about what actually, there are many things that make life worthwhile, or that make us able to perceive life as profoundly worthwhile. And independence of various kinds, including being able to, learning how to do things by ourselves that we didn't previously know how to do, learning doing something ourselves, and then looking at it and saying, I figured out how to do this and I did it. Those are wonderful things. But it's also true that we are the kinds of creatures, we are social animals. We are political animals. And one of the things that it means to be a political animal is that if you actually think about the idea of having no one depend on you, no one who is depending on you, and you being unable to depend on anyone, that's kind of a hideous dystopian vision. Like, that is the vision of someone who is lonely. And the word lonely is a negative word in our world. And the idea that all of one's relationships can be these very kind of like hands-off, don't hold me too close, don't love me too much kinds of relationships. That's a very impoverished view of what it is to be human.
Yeah, I think one place that we see that is, first of all, in Stephen Sondheim's notable concept musical Company, which is an exploration of what marriage is, but has an entire song of promising not to need someone too much. You promise whatever you want, I'll never collect. And the idea of making marriage manageable, of making it a small enough promise that we can actually keep it by our own efforts, rather than when we kind of acknowledge that we want to take on more than what we can control and more than what we can kind of fit into a small manageable box. Marriage is making a promise that goes beyond just our will and our ability to keep it. And it does that because it's a sacrament. We have more backstopping us than we start with. And the more that we kind of abhor dependence or indebtedness to others, the more we limit our vision of what we can do only to what we can accomplish on our own. there's a really striking image near the beginning of David Graeber's book on debt of just how insulting it is in some cultures to pay back a debt exactly. Because what makes relationship, he says, is this kind of sloshing around of debt. You give me a chicken, I give you a fair amount of produce, but not the exact worth of a chicken, because we keep owing each other and we expect to keep having commerce with each other. But for you to give me a chicken and then for me to come back and say, and here is another chicken, I have paid you back exactly, I am free of you, is, as you said, lonely. It's insulting to an extent. It's saying, I don't want to have an ongoing relationship of debt with you. And to be honest, when I read that, that's when a friend and I stopped splitting the check at the dinners we would have every month and started alternating who paid, knowing it wasn't going to exactly match up, but wanting that sense of this goes on and there's a sloshing debt between us that is part of our friendship, not a neat division after which we're always ready to be quits.
Yeah. I wonder whether one of you could speak to the question of what does this mean for politics? Like if our politics are the standard politics that we grew up with are liberal, what does an illiberal politics that is informed by this illiberal vision of humanity that we've been talking about look like? I also wanted to just say, if any of you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the YouTube chat and they will get relayed to me and I'll ask them towards the end, but also kind of interspersed throughout. So please ask your questions. So how about, what is a post-liberal politics or an illiberal politics? What does politics mean in a world where we are not independent creatures, but in fact, dependent rational animals?
Well, I think to start with the question of just how we think about welfare, right? Like thinking about when we support people who are poor, are we trying to support them alone, or are we trying to support their whole community and expecting, that money will flow back and forth between people, so that, when we're supporting a single mother with kids, we expect as part of what we do when we support her that she has other people besides her own family to support. Bonds to people in her community, and also asking, all right, well, do we, help make sure money gets to the folks for whom it's natural to support her? Really looking at not just how do we target the isolated individual who just needs to be brought up to a certain level and can work on her own, but what networks of support are around her, and for anyone we help, who is it that they need to help, who is dependent on them?
Mm-hmm. To what degree?
Can I just get in?
Yes, Jenn.
Sorry. I mean, I'm a philosopher, so I'm not very good at any sort of particular political proposals or policies. But what I would really like to see, just kind of at the level of theory, is a complete reorientation in how we think, one, about human beings. So sort of like the anthropological base of any politics, right? Insofar as society, is made up of humans and exists for humans, we need to rethink, what the human is, because the model at the center of it right now, I think, is again a false self-image. But I would also like to see, as part of that, a re-envisioning of what it means to be free, right? That freedom is not just sort of freedom of choice, but freedom to flourish, right? To excel as a human being, and to recognize that we only flourish together. That is to say that the sort of good that pertains to human beings are common goods, right? And they're common goods that grow out of our nature. And so we ought, I think, to be shifting our talk of freedom from talk of autonomy to talking about, freedom being a negotiation with the given, and particularly with the given reality of the kinds of things that we actually are and the actual needs that we have, just as human beings. And then we can talk about, the different needs that we have as men and women, given that we have different bodies. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, I want to see the change at a very high level of generality.
And I think to kind of bring that into the concrete when we talk about this question of responsibility for the common good. One policy project I like is the Family Fun Pack from the People's Policy Project, which talks about supporting families. And it really cuts against the idea that having a family is something you save up for or earn, but that having children is something that comes naturally out of marriage. It isn't something you wait till you've worked for long enough to afford. And it's something that all of us are invested in without having to be related to the particular children, because children are part of what make us a society. And that we don't give parents, aid based on merit. We give them aid because they are parents. So I've dropped, a link in for conveying to the YouTube group, but I think that's a nice concrete policy, and it both kind of gets into the nitty-gritty of how do we pay for this, but it really starts from how do people qualify for this? And the answer is because they are people and because children require care, and it's up to all of us to give it to them, not because they've jumped through the following bureaucratic hoops or proven their need.
So we've talked quite a bit about liberalism and sort of illiberal humanity, but we did, Leah, your piece did in particular talk about women. And I guess one of the things that I have a kind of constellation of questions, some of which are things that watchers have dropped in. Are men and women, in what ways are men and women not the same? Are men and women basically the same except for a little bit of biology? What do we mean by gender essentialism? Is it a question of bell curve distributions, or is there a female nature? And what difference does that make in how we should approach each other and live with each other?
All right, who goes first?
I think, Jen, you're the more researched on this on the philosophy, and then I'll jump in with my empirics after.
Okay, yeah, well, I mean, look, we're all humans, right? So we all bear human form. And so in that sense, we're all exactly the same. And that's incredibly important, because everything that we would want to say about human flourishing and common goods is going to come out of our shared nature as human beings. So I don't believe in anything that is, female nature, but just metaphysically, I think that's not going to work, and we don't need that anyway. The difference between men and women is in their bodies, right? And that I think is the most basic difference. And I think that has real implications for the way we are in the world. So I think that we're hylomorphic composites, right? So so the way that I see and desire things, I think, is characteristically related to the sort of body that I have. So I think men and women are different, and I think this is important because if we really think that at the end of the day that there's no difference, or the only difference is that women are nodes in a system of oppression that needs to be overturned, that there's actually nothing positive about being a woman, it's all negative, then I think it's kind of unclear why it's so important to have women at the table. If we really are interchangeable with men, if we're not really bringing anything unique in terms of perspective or experience or judgment, then it's really unclear why we aren't, in fact, just interchangeable. And it would be fine if there were just all men at the table. And so yeah, I sort of get dismayed at forms of feminism that want to erase femininity or say nothing positive about it. It's all negative. I think there should be something positive about it. I don't have a neat and tiny line about what the positive thing is, but I would also say there's a lot of empirical data that, men and women do see things slightly differently. I think we have to be careful, because there's a long tradition of saying kind of stupid things about women. And it's in the tradition that I really love, so I love Aristotle. I'm very upfront about this. I love Aquinas, but they say some really stupid stuff about women. And I think, I don't want to have anything to do with that. I don't think it's true that men are wiser than women, or that women need men to make decisions for them because, they're too hysterical or whatever. All of that is based on actually a false biology that Aristotle and Aquinas are both committed to. So I think we need to be careful about. I think we need to be cognizant of and careful of these traditions which emphasize the differences between men and women. And it turns out women are the weaker sex, the lesser sex, the truly dependent ones. But I would want to preserve a space for difference. And actually, we can look to the lives of amazing women if we want to get a pretty good account of what femininity might look like. And there are plenty of women voices and lives for us to be looking at.
Yeah, Susanna, to speak to your question of what's the difference between men and women, I'm going to give you 3 tiers of answer very briefly. The first is that at the most basic level, we're all made in the image of God, and that's the most important thing about us as men and as women, and that's not different in dignity for either of us. So at that level, no difference. We're called to be saints, we're made in the image of God. Now, at the next level, there are things that really are, I think the most crucial differences do relate to bearing children, whether or not a woman actually does, but because it shapes who we are, what risks we take, and what we're vulnerable to. I think that's, for me, kind of one of the most central differences. And then there are a lot of differences where we can talk about differences that are true in the aggregate for men and women without being true for individuals. The boring one is height. In general, men are taller than women. You can think of them a bell curve that's shifted to the side. Women are over here. They overlap. A given man might be shorter than a given woman. But in general, if I say I have a man and a woman, which one is taller? Guess. I put my money on the guy. Now, most of those don't have any real moral weight to them. And where the moral weight comes in for me is the way that there's a lot of just natural variation within sexes as well as between sexes. But we live in a world that's most often designed around men as the default. There's a great book called Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. That's really all about this gap between how, even just how drugs are tested, where they're often sized for men's bodies for the dosage rather than women. And that really speaks to this pushing out or the denial of women's equal dignity. There's nothing that makes you more morally worthy in being broad-shouldered and large, and our drugs shouldn't all be calibrated to the dosage for that size. And I know we're going to talk a little about what we understand feminism to be, but in large part, it's kind of correcting a lot of those errors that we live in a world that takes men as the pattern for humanity. And then especially in medicine, I'd say, takes women as the kind of buggy variant rather than a type in our own right. And it takes a lot of work to just get people to say, what if we designed the world to let men and women move through it together? I saw there was a question in the chat about disability as well. And this is an idea that really comes across in disability theory too, that, only so much of disability is about the actual change in your body or how it functions. But there's also a social component to disability where if the whole world is made of stairs, you're more disabled, whether you're in a wheelchair or just have mobility issues, than if there are ramps. And we make choices to include or exclude different kinds of people and different kinds of bodies based on how we design the world around us. And I see a lot of misogyny in the way we design the world, sometimes accidental, in that there's only men in the room making the design, and they don't check to see what needs to be done to include half of everyone else.
Yeah, and sorry, just really fast. I want to follow up with that point about medicine. This is something that I teach in my medical ethics classes all the time. You can think about, there's all of this literature about differential outcomes between men and women when it comes to having heart attacks. So women are twice as likely to die as men. And it turns out the reason why is that the classic symptoms, right, that you're having a heart attack are male coded. That is to say, they're the symptoms that occur in men. And so when women come in having a different set of symptoms, they don't get the care that they need, right? Even though right? They are presenting just in a different way for a heart attack. And so again, not recognizing the differences can have really bad outcomes. And always switching to male coded norms as the default has a lot of really terrible outcomes for women.
And the book I was thinking of for, this kind of false norm as related to disability for the person in the comments who asked is, what can a body do? How we meet the built world.
Ooh. So Leah, you did mention that we had been planning to talk a little bit about what feminism is, whether or not we identify as feminist, what some of the problems with versions of feminism could be. And I guess I wanted to add a question, which is, in looking at these ways in which the world can be more designed for men, how do we avoid a kind of sense of, how do we build in the ideas that we talked about at the beginning of this call, which have to do with the idea of interdependence and men and women needing each other rather than being natural adversaries or something like that?
Yeah, I think it's good to remember whenever we're told that someone or a whole group of people are our natural adversary, first of all, as Christians, we should suspect it's untrue. And then second, as kind of productively cynical people, we should look at who's profiting from setting us against each other. So I don't think men and women are natural enemies. I do think, it's not uncommon whenever folks are frustrated or unhappy to feel more settled by feeling superior to someone else or by repelling a threat. And I do feel I encounter that kind of hostility sometimes when women ask to have room made for us and then respond as though that will take something away from them. Now, to be honest, it will to an extent, but it will take it away in the service of justice. So on net, that gives men a greater gift than living unjustly. But that sense women have of moving through a world that isn't designed for us, and those moments of friction of just, having to pick something rather than having the default be made for you, are something I want men to experience, because we don't live in a world with only one default. So I guess this is my message to men who are wondering exactly in what way I'm going to make their lives harder. My goal is to have us both move through a world in which it takes a little bit of deliberate action and deliberate choice to find what fits us, and that will make things much easier for people who lived further from the default and a little irritating for people who live nearer to the default. But we'll all live in a more just and compassionate world, so we come out ahead.
How about you, Jen? What do you think about the question of feminism?
I think it's tricky. I mean, my whole life, it's been really tricky. I mean, obviously, nobody wants to say I'm not a feminist, because what would that really mean, right? But whenever I have been in spaces, with feminists, they tend to not really appreciate my point of view, to put it mildly. So, and I'm told that I'm a bad feminist, or I can't be a feminist because I'm Catholic, or because of my views about sex or abortion or whatever, because I don't subscribe to certain core tenets. And in particular, because I don't think that women should fear their fertility. Yeah. So, and in fact, the inculcation of that fear is actually really terrible for women, and that we should resist it. So I don't know. I mean, if feminism is just being for social equality and being against misogyny, then sure, I'm a feminist. But if it's accepting a whole lot of theory that I absolutely do not accept, then no. And also, if I look to the women who have been so important for me in terms of being exemplars that I want to imitate, both in the intellectual life and the spiritual life, they don't really self-identify as feminists. So if I think of my favorite philosophers who are women, like Philippa Foot or Elizabeth Anscombe or Iris Murdoch, they're not doing feminist theory. And yet they're just these trailblazing lady philosophers, doing it so much better than so many of the men around them, or like Mary Midgley, so I or Hannah Arendt. I mean, just there's so many. where I just feel like I have these exemplars of, what it looks like to go out in the world and be a woman and do philosophy. And none of it really seems to depend on feminist theory. So it kind of leads me in a place where I'm not really sure. I know that I am definitely, I'm definitely against misogyny. I'm definitely very pro-woman. Whether or not that makes me a feminist, I think is for really people who are defining feminism and doing feminist theories, probably for them to decide.
I think we're just too close in history to real structural legal bars for women's equal participation in the workforce, in the economy, in society, to write off whether or not the theory, the political movement that struck down those laws and built a framework for challenging them. And that's one of the reasons I do embrace the term feminism. I think it's not so long ago, if I tell my age, it's not so long ago, it's in my in between my mother and my grandmother's age, where women could routinely be fired for being pregnant, where women, couldn't have an independent checkbook or bank account from their husband, couldn't have a way of, building up financial security. And those victories were hard won, and they involved building up a legal theory where I have some quibbles with parts of it, but it was an important fight. It's not over. I think the biggest tension for me is whether you're founding those victories on the sense of women being equal in dignity to men and then needing to be treated in accord with that dignity, which I don't believe our old laws did, or women being equal because they're interchangeable with men, which I don't think is a good foundation to make our pitch on, simply because we're not interchangeable. There are some important differences we discussed, but again, the more you frame your demand for legal or social dignity on the basis of equal capacity, the quicker the elderly, the disabled, et cetera, will all fall right out of that qualification.
Yeah, sorry, I agree with all of that. But I think, again, it gets back to the question of whether or not feminism, we're really talking about theory or practice. And I guess I'm thinking that to some extent, they can be kept separate for some of the reasons that you mentioned.
Jenn, you talked about the sort of some of the exemplars or models in your own career who you've looked to as inspirations. Leah, who are some of do you have any recommendations for young women in their late teens or early 20s who are growing into and grappling with womanhood and society or politics or their own ambitions? Who are those role models for you, and what are the books that have helped you as you've navigated those questions? And Jenn, if you have any others to add, I'd love to hear that from you as well.
I do think a tricky thing is, and everyone can tell I've been dropping book titles this whole time, but a really tricky thing is that when we look primarily to books, and I do this all the time, we look at women who are writers or women who are reached by writers, which is actually a narrow slice of who women are. So the people I admire are a mix of folks who are interesting thinkers and interesting writers, but also just folks who don't have any kind of notable public life, but that I reach out to as my patterns, folks who are kind of, I think of a few years ahead of me. There are a couple of families that my family has had tight connections to because we admire how they're raising their kids and the relationship they have as a marriage. And they haven't written any books on the subject. So I'd really encourage folks listening to think about taking your models, both from people who develop a theory and can write it up, persuasively, and to people who simply have the gift of living a good life, and to apprentice yourself to the folks you can still have dinner with and talk through problems with.
So sorry, was the question about what
exemplars or inspirations,
yeah,
favorite books that you would recommend to a young woman?
Well, I talk to young women all the time about this stuff. I mean, all the time, about how to navigate this stuff, especially young Catholic women, especially in light of a lot of online bro Catholicism that tends to lean heavily on Aquinas. They're like, oh, what do you think about that? And of course, I think it's all terrible. But and also done by people who are not Aquinas scholars by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, I mean, what I always try to tell young women, is that it's not wrong for them to be ambitious. It's not wrong. There's not something wrong with them if they're an ambitious writer or they're an ambitious thinker. If they want to pursue these things, it's really healthy and good to want. Well, I mean, not ambition for its own sake, but to have dreams and aspirations. Let me switch to aspiration talk. That this is all really good. And that they can focus on that as a young person. They don't have to be focused on finding a husband or whatever. I mean, I certainly was not focused as a young person on finding a husband. So all of that is fine. And I'm like really intensely aware that they're looking at me as some kind of model and like desperately not wanting to, mess that up for them. But I also talk to them about, how much of a sacrifice it is. I have 6 kids. Like, I don't get a lot of sleep. I'm sure I'll probably have like early onset dementia. It's fine. It'll be worth it. That there's a lot of sacrifice. And I always tell them, like, you can't do it all. It's completely false to think that you can do it all. But here's the thing, they always tell women this, but it's true of men too. Yeah. They can't do it all either, but somehow like we all pretend they can, or they should. It's totally crazy. And I think, I also tell them, when they're dating or thinking about a husband, they want to find someone who is supportive, right? Who doesn't think that it's unmanly to change a diaper and get up in the middle of the night when the kid is screaming and make dinner, right? It is not unmanly to cook a meal any more than it's unwomanly, to be a philosophy professor. So yeah, we have all kinds of really intense, great conversations about this.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that in some ways women are asked to take on too much with too little support. We are encouraged in the present day for most women to both consider a life at home and a life in the workplace, and then possibly even a social life outside of that one gets left by the wayside a little. But men are a lot less encouraged to make a life for themselves at home, and perhaps are given the support they need at work, but have a whole sphere of their life that's kind of unspoken. When you think how rare it is to hear men speak in public about a longing for children, or as that is part of why they want to get married or worry that they'll miss out on. You can hear how much men are kind of being cut off from part of human experience and from the room to really utter that longing. I will say after suggesting just apprenticeships generally, I will recommend as a contemporary writer, Abigail Favale's memoir, Into the Deep, which I thought was a really fascinating book about the experience of her Catholicism and feminism side by side. But I think the last thing I'd say is this question of ambition. One of the things I'm grateful for as a Catholic is that I both have a very large ambition, which is to be a saint, and that can be lived out in a variety of lives and vocations and strengths. So when we talk about, what does it mean to be ambitious? I think if we start with the ambition of, being a saint, having friendship with God and being a channel of grace into the world, that's the biggest ambition you could have. Now, it doesn't tell you anything useful about, do you need to live out that vocation as a mother, as a philosopher, as both at the same time? But it does kind of make some of those other questions secondary to the question of, am I acting rightly towards the people around me? Am I carrying and passing on the graces I've been given? One saint, Saint Raphael Arnaiz Baron, was someone who wanted to live a Trappist life in enclosure and couldn't because he had diabetes, and his illness kept getting in the way of his vocation. And from a secular point of view, even acknowledging as a secular point of view may not be excited for him being a monk, you can see how his ambition in the world was frustrated again and again because his illness kept preventing him from living out the ambition he'd had to give his life entirely to God in a particular way. But he's a saint because he accepted those constraints and still every day turned his life over to God. I think in a lot of these discussions of ambition, the reality is wherever we are and however compromised our capacities, however compromised our brilliance or our physical bodies, we're still free to be saints and to give whatever we have to God. And then every other question of ambition comes second to that ambition.
Yeah, I think that so we have a question here that touches very much on, I think, something that you've just mentioned in a kind of a roundabout way. Our Bria Sanford, who's a friend of some of us, is writes, is illiberal versus liberal really the distinction between a feminism that protects weakness and glorifies interdependence and one that doesn't? So she says, I get the argument that viewing the individual as the primary building block of society is bad, but I can think of societies that prioritize family, tradition, and culture. Those are sort of traditionally illiberal ideas, while despising weakness, for example, committing infanticide and pathologizing aspects of femininity. So we can think of, ancient Rome, for example. It was an illiberal culture in many ways, but and it was one that certainly had a valued hierarchy. But one of the things that it did with that was it thought that it was okay to kill your children if you didn't like the way that they came out. So it seems to me that one of the things that we've talked about, but we have not specifically talked about in these terms, is what is the difference that Christianity makes to illiberalism in some sense? And what is the difference that Christianity might make to considering both old age and infancy?
Well, I think the difference that Christianity makes in terms of ethics is that it sees the human person as of inviolable dignity and worth, intrinsic inviolable dignity and worth. And that is why, it was a dividing line between the pagans and the early Christian communities, exposure, infanticide, these sorts of things. The early Christians were completely against it. And I think it has to do with that. And this reverence for the dignity of human life is a big difference. It does make a big difference. It's like whenever I'm teaching medical ethics, at the end of the day, it all comes down to that, whether or not you have reverence for it or you don't. Because if you have reverence for it, then you will never want to divide the humans into two kinds, namely those you can kill and those you can't. It will just always be wrong to kill an innocent human being, no matter how much of their wits they have lost or how undeveloped they are. Insofar as we can say that it's a human being, it will have that dignity.
Yeah, I think what we're getting at here is that this question of liberalism and illiberalism touches on one untruth we can tell about humans, and one untruth that's particularly prevalent in our society, that autonomy is natural and desirable. Now, that's not the only lie that gets told. And so kind of curbing it in no way guarantees we won't make other serious errors of the type Bria is describing. And that's really where we get to the difference between, are we calling out a particular error and trying to curb it, which I do sometimes because it helps narrow the focus of discussion, or are we trying to utter the full and complete truth and hold that up to outshine the error? Because I know that someone in the comments I have seen is sad that they feel this is too Christian-centered a discussion already. But I agree with Jenn from the beginning that liberalism isn't neutrality, and a naked public square isn't neutrality. In fact, it really limits how we can have this discussion of how do we treat each other and what is our dignity grounded on if we can't admit what we think the answers actually are. So there's really an extent to which I can't critique liberalism without praising Catholicism, because I don't mean to just undercut this one idea and leave nothing to replace it. I want to point to a full philosophy that has a fuller answer than just the converse of an error.
Well, let me just follow up on that, because I think I might be slightly more pagan. Anyway, so when it comes to like political theory, Aristotle's not a liberal, right? And I think that there's much of value in Aristotle's basic political framework. And so I don't think that, we need to go like integralist or full hog Christianity, because I think a lot of a lot of the objections that I would want to make are just, they're like right there in Aristotle. Because I think Aristotle had like really deep, profound, amazing insights into what it is to be human. And of course, he's not a Christian, but I think, but there is something that Christianity adds right to the picture. And I think that, one of the tricky things is thinking about politically, how much of that distinctive thing gets taken up into our account of the common good, because obviously we're not all Christian. So I was not raised a Christian, for example. So yeah, I think that's I certainly would stop short of any kind of integralism as the political theory that I want to put forward. But I think there are other kinds of illiberalism where, we can have the sorts of conversations that we're having, and we can still demand that we reconceive feminism so that it's more in line with humanity, right? Regardless of, doctrinal commitments about being made in the image of God, even though I think there is something like that idea in Plato and Aristotle as well, but it's not inflected in the same way.
If you're going to position yourself as more of a pagan than me, Jen, I'll be more of the pugilist than you, since I'm also a convert. And when I say I think people should bring their full philosophy to bear more often than I think we think is socially acceptable, it's in part because I'm grateful that friends did. Because to me, having these fights and bringing the fullness of what brings us to it, as well as tactically, using folks who agree with us without sharing all of our ideas like Aristotle, is part of how we just invite people into things that are good because they're true. And so to an extent, when a friend kind of tries to correct my error narrowly, they're failing to invite me into the full world of truth. They're just saying, Leah, you're wrong on this point because of your bad premises, but we'll leave them aside and just fix this small niggling thing. And I'm like, no, free me from all my chains of error at once. Take a big sword and slash them down and invite me into the truth in which you live.
Well, I'll just say that that's wonderful, but not everyone takes that view.
I, as also a convert, actually, and as a convert to illiberalism, as well as a convert to Christianity, it seems to me that one of the things that we do need to do as we sort of have conversations about this is to sort of see the truth that people may have already grasped and kind of elevate that, even if there are ways, and try to build on the things that we hold in common, even if we disagree with them in other ways. One of the very difficult ways that we can run into this is, Jen, you referred to the girls or the women that you teach as sort of running into online Thomist bros. And I have encountered the online Thomist bros a good deal. I kind of love a lot of the online Thomist bros, and I love St. Thomas, but there are also terrible ones. And one reader or one watcher writes in, I've noticed a tendency for people who I would consider misogynistic, or at least who are generally unsympathetic to concerns about misogyny, to be positive about intellectual discussions of household economics, the rejection of autonomy, etc. They seem to perceive these movements as a way of getting women back in their place, so to speak. How do you view these sorts of fellow travelers, and what is the best way to respond to them? And I also want to say, I don't mean to say that all of these are online Thomist bros. There are a whole bunch of kind of like men's rights activisty types out there who are not Thomist bros.
Yeah, so I mean, this is online and offline. I mean, given the circles that I run in, there's always a guy who will come up to me at some point and be like, it's like a way of testing me, I think it's against the natural law for women to work outside the home. They'll say this to me after I gave a philosophy talk. And I'm just like, I don't take the bait most of the time, because they're trying to get a rise out of me. But I will push on whatever it is that they're trying to say there. And it's usually based on some kind of really ahistorical picture of what a family looks like, where a family is like a nuclear unit and dad goes off, into the office all day and he's the provider and mom stays at home. And I'm like, well, like most of human history, it wasn't like that at all, right? Or I try to lean, on their authorities. And they'll usually cite out of context, like some document, some papal encyclical, and it's like, well, but let's look at these other papal documents since then, right? Because truth can't contradict truth. And or they might depend on authority. I mean, I had one man tell him that the papal theologian taught him this, and I'm like, that's funny, I know the papal theologian. I'll have to ask him. So I did. And like, these aren't, I really think for a lot of them, especially the really online ones, the best thing you can do is ignore it, because why give attention to something that doesn't merit it? But I think, like, when someone approaches you with this, whether it's a man or a woman, you can usually just tease out the weak point, right? But the main thing is, don't get angry, right? Because I think that's what they want, and you shouldn't give people like that what they want, I think.
I think that's a great point, and it kind of speaks to a question I've seen come up, which is how can men help further this project of illiberal feminism, a culture of interdependence. And one thing is running interference if you see a guy trying to get a rise out of a woman on a question about the relation of men and women, kind of indicate, like, do you want me to step in? Do you want me to have this fight for you? Is a reasonable thing to do, because the guys who are doing it specifically to bully women don't always deserve a reply from a woman. Now, I think some of this comes out of just a real temporal narrowness, like you said, Jen, that certainly, like, 1950s suburban America is not a return to the Middle Ages, and you can't possibly argue for both at the same time. If you're saying, like, let's go back to antiquity and have fasting and feasting days constantly and large extended families, you're winning me over bit by bit, right? But definitely, be suspicious of anyone who isn't pointing to a real example of the society they're trying to build, or who feels like they're going to be the most powerful person in that society. Right. And when those people kind of come along to boost us because they feel like they're getting closer to their kind of flawed or limited project for what we're saying, I think one thing that's helpful is a framework that I've seen Matthew Loftus apply to questions about race, which is, he just said that pastors should ask themselves a question, which is, if people steeped in racial hatred attended my church, what would they have heard in the last 5 years that challenged such an attitude? And I think for all of us, including in our everyday life, if there are people who are misogynist, whether kind of actively and with malice or kind of passively and through not thinking it through in my day-to-day life, what do I do or say or recommend or lift up that challenges them? Because only sometimes should we kind of have a fight with the people who are seeking it, who, you're right, Jen, are not always seeking it in good faith or want something besides a discussion. They just want to provoke someone or feel like they have power over them. We should have that fight by starting it every day in friendship and song and joyfulness, not by just making it a pitched fight, but by asking, where am I holding up things that would challenge a misogynist view of the world? And again, to be concrete, where am I looking at people who are weak and praising them and visibly valuing them, and especially not just valuing them for triumphing over weakness? I think one thing that's good that we do is, there was a lot of praise recently for a young man with Down syndrome who completed a triathlon, which is excellent. But that's not the argument for the humanity of people with Down syndrome. It's not about, because he succeeded at doing this, we now have permission to value him. So be careful kind of how you lift up dependence and weakness. Women aren't impressive because they are weak and always triumph over it, or because, oh, she balances work and family so well in our misogynist culture, she navigates it. this is my friend, I value her. She's kind of overwhelmed because our society asks impossible things of her. So I'm doing my part to take on the obligation we all should feel. Don't only hold up strong and admirable people as dignified and worthy of respect. Hold up people who are genuinely struggling in a society that doesn't make room for their dignity, and then make room for it yourself and ask how you can serve.
Thank you so much, Leah, and thank you, Jenn. This was just an excellent conversation, and as always, it made me feel as though I needed to tell myself 1,000 times, all right, we don't need to talk about absolutely everything in the world in order to talk about this piece of it, because this just felt so rich. So again, I want to thank, this is a partial launch for Plough's family issue, What Are Families For? And I would love it if everyone who's watching went and subscribed to that magazine, which I am a senior editor of, and Leah is a contributing editor for. And you will not be disappointed. Thank you also to Breaking Ground, breakingground.us, which is another co-sponsor, which I'm also an editor on. And please also check out Leah's Substack, Other Feminisms, which that link should have been dropped in. Scroll up if you are looking for that link in the YouTube chat. And also do not miss Jenn's Sacred and Profane Love podcast. I guess I want to end, since we started with esoteric Sondheim quotes, I want to end with John Anderson, another watcher, dropped this Avett Brothers song quote in the chat, circling back to the question of what illiberalism is. Free is not your right to choose. It's answering what's asked of you, to give the love you found until it's gone. So thank you all. Good night, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Susanna. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.